Welcome to the Magdalene Voices, giving voice to those silenced for centuries through sacred conversations with beautiful, illuminating souls. I am your host and facilitator, Maria Estella. I serve radiant beings just like you, committed to awakening through love and the deep sacred work required to not only unveil the truth of who you are, what you are, and why you came, but also to express that truth and knowledge through the work that you do in this world. If you haven't already, I highly encourage you to join my sacred circle to stay connected and updated. You can do so on my website, mariaestella.com. I currently offer sacred journeys for soulful entrepreneurs and Magdalene's rising, wanting to embrace, embody, and express their divine feminine and divine masculine essences of being and doing, as well as work deeply with their shadow aspects, ultimately serving the world in its unveiling, awakening, healing, enlightenment, and ascension. In my sacred journeys, I not only facilitate, but I also catalyze the expression of your soul's divine purpose, supporting you in bringing forth that which you are here to birth. If you're curious about my work, go to mariaestella.com to find out more. And if you have ever wondered about your own personal Magdalene connection and calling, whether you are a Magdalene or not, I invite you to download the Magdalene Blueprint that I have created for you. Go to mariaestella.com/AYM to get it. Today I'm joined by Alexis P. Morgan from Church of St. Felicia for a sacred conversation about how she, an African American woman, came to convert to the Nordic faith of Asetru, and also how she found her way to the Creole Vodoo. Alexis is the pole-dancing, sword-wielding, democratic socialist, on the low hero sorceress that you've been warned about. She makes her chatter as a professional writer, facilitator, artist, ritualist, and priestess. Devoted to truth, justice, and liberation, she lives in the spirit of her foremothers before her, unbossed, unbought, and unbothered. As with all of the sacred conversations here on the Magdalene Voices, I invite you to listen with an open heart and mind. Some of the topics and areas that Alexis and I dive into may be unfamiliar, uncomfortable, and even controversial. I and we invite you to take what serves you and leave the rest. Also, if you would like to support Alexis in her writing, go to her Patreon page at patreon.com/ALXPMorgan and become a monthly subscriber. Alexis, welcome to the Magdalene Voices. I think I say this with all of my guests, but I'm truly thrilled that you're here and very honored that you would have chosen to grace us with your presence. I know that you are a multi-layered, faceted woman who has a lot of things going on, so I appreciate that you were taking the time to do this. The thing that pulled me in and made me reach out to you was that I saw at some point on your website that you are a Black African American woman who have a faith that is based in Northern Folkways and Vodoo. And me being Danish, being brought up in Denmark, basically having Thor and Odin and all those people in my background or in my neighborhood, and not having any form of relationship with them or to them or know even other than from cartoons, I thought that was such a interesting combination, and I wanted to learn more. So will you share your faith or your what happened? Like how did you what happened? Tell me what happened, or tell us what happened.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for having me. I'm always thrilled to come talk with people about all sorts of things. As a writer, that's kind of what I do. But the answer to that question is a little bit complex. I was raised by white lesbians. So one of my mothers was Catholic and actually almost became a nun, which is always a fun story. Yeah. And then my other mother was Jewish and descended from Russian and Polish Jews. So when I was little, I was initially raised as Catholic because it was the closest sort of like religious institution to where we were at the time. And when I was a teenager, I never really connected with Jesus like on the personal savior level. I was always very interested in spirituality and sort of like the church itself, like the symbols of the church always kind of like fascinated me. Yeah. But it was always like the very pagan kind of dimensions of the Catholic tradition. Of all the Christian traditions, Catholics are probably the most pagan. But when I was a teenager, I went through a brief period where I was in the, it's a funny story because I went to the library and I actually had a book hit me on the head. Like it fell off the shelf because I think I must have bumped into one of the library shelves. And Elaine McCoy's If You Want to Be a Witch knocked me on the head. And of course, like I saw this book and I was just like, yes, I do want to be a witch. How did you know? So I had like this brief little love affair with neo-paganism and with Wicca, and I never really like felt like an emotional connection to goddess or god, and it wasn't a good fit. But during the process of sort of like exploring, I had my first sort of brush with Asetru, which is like I don't want to say the more orthodox version of like Northern paganism, but we'll go with that. And at the time, basically it's sort of like the general feeling of the Wiccan community is that, you know, people who are involved with Asetru and with Northern sort of paganism, they have a white supremacist problem. And that is kind of like a cover for white supremacist beliefs. So I was just like, nah, I'm good. I'm gonna leave those gods and those practices over there. And I went about my merry way. But it wasn't until I ended up in rural Tennessee. I was living with the woman who used to be my nanny when I was a very small child. She's very, very, very evangelical, like very evangelical. And I couldn't openly sort of practice anything. So I ended up like world walking and sort of getting into like moving into the astral realms, other realms, for lack of a better way to describe it, as kind of a way for me to practice. And one day when I was doing that, I had this random goddess just kind of appear while I was world walking for a client. And I was like, sup? Who are you? Why are you here? And she told me her name. And I was just like, okay. And she said, oh, I'm a goddess of, you know, I'm a Norse goddess. I got a feeling that she was a goddess. And I was just like, this is a little weird. And I ended up logging off, like I was logging off the internet. I ended up coming out of this trance and looking her up. And it turns out she was a goddess. And it was Eir, E-I-R. And she is she's a fairly minor figure in Norse mythology, and she's kind of the equivalent of a battlefield surgeon. And I was really freaked out by that because unless I had been looking for it, I wouldn't have come across it. No. And it just kind of spiraled from there. And after Eir showed up, then Freya showed up. And then after Freya showed up, Odin showed up. And I was just like, y'all are like getting a little bit too close. And y'all do realize I'm black, right? like you do realize what you're asking me here. And it just kind of unfolded from there. And as I sort of started digging into kind of pre-Christian Nordic and Pan-Germanic values, it actually really resonated with me. And the mythology really spoke to me. And the sort of like roles of women, even though they weren't super far ahead of the surrounding cultures at the time, really kind of struck me. And then I found out that my best friend, Michelle, who I met, and she's basically my other half, like at this point, found out that she was a Norse pagan too. And I was just like, well, here we go. Finito, I'm done. And I ended up converting, or what I would say is converting in 2013. So it's kind of like a long meandering road to the Norse practices. I kind of got dragged kicking and screaming like all the way there.
I love that. Because that's usually what it is when quote unquote, when they find us, we don't, I mean, I remember I'm not with the Norse. For me, it was Yeshua and Mary Magdalene. For me, it was like I'm not Christian. Are you kidding me? Like, nah, I don't want anything to do with it. So I love how you were like, are you sure? Have you seen it? But I know that you also combine it with Vodoo and how did that happen?
So that is a relatively recent and new thing for me. So I've been around people who have practiced the African traditional religions or the African diasporic traditional religions for a good bit now. I'm actually kind of surprised at how many santeros and santeras and babalaos and various other priests and practitioners I actually do know. And I have always kind of been aware, at least for the last like 3-4 years, give or take-ish, of the various sort of like the slave kind of like Christian syncretic faiths that have developed, especially here in the New World, or what was termed as the New World. But the thing about the African traditional religions is that they're traditionally very secretive because they had to sort of protect their beliefs, and because if they got caught practicing, it could be death. And also because it's very community oriented. So most of the time, like it's really kind of unusual to be a quote unquote solitary practitioner of any of these faiths, because it's very oriented to family and community. And I'm not really a joiner. Like, and also like if you elect to serve, well, actually, let me backtrack. So in addition to that, who becomes clergy and sort of how you practice and like the structures and all of that are really sort of based on, you can't just decide that you want to become a babalao or become a santera or a santero. Like there's divination that goes into that. There's rituals and initiations that go into that. And usually if you're called to serve, they make it very obvious. So like there are a whole bunch of factors that sort of had me like looking at like the ATR. I was like, okay, I respect this. I want to understand this a little more, but I'm cool. So that happened, and I'm not going to get into the details because it's a long meandering story. But basically, this past summer, I started working with a therapist to sort of start my grief counseling, because one of my parents committed suicide last year. And in the process of unpacking her departure and how she died and the abuse that happened to me when I was a child, and my family more or less selling me, which is a whole thing. I said to my therapist, I don't know how my ancestors survived, being sold. I really don't know how they could find a way to live and sort of like get through the experience of being dehumanized in such like a fundamental way. And having sort of gone through a proximal experience myself, with my family choosing to sort of throw me onto the pyre in exchange for, financial security, that was something that was obviously like right in my face. And every time I had asked for support or for feedback from the community or whatever it was, I couldn't find an answer to that question. And my therapist, because she's also a woman of color, and she's both a psychotherapist as well as a spiritual practitioner, said to me, well, have you asked them? Okay. I was like, no, I should probably do that.
Can I just ask?
Good suggestion. That was a wise suggestion. And she suggested a ritual that I could do to do that. So I ended up doing that ritual. And several months later, I was guided to this blog post That was an interview with Sally Ann Glassman, who is a white woman, but she is a voodoo priestess in the Haitian tradition, at least, who practices down in New Orleans. And they were talking to her about being a vegan, of all things. And right smack in the middle of this article was a quote from Sally Ann that basically said voodoo is a beautiful religion that helped them survive what was fundamentally unsurvivable and unendurable. And as soon as I read that quote, I burst into tears, and I just felt something in my heart. And from there, I sort of like tentatively put out my feelers, and I learned that there are actually 3 different types of voodoo. So there's Haitian voodoo, which I wouldn't call it orthodox, but lack of a better word, orthodox. And then there's New Orleans voodoo or Creole voodoo, Louisiana voodoo, depending any of those, that developed separately from the tradition in Haiti, but has a little bit of crossover there because of immigration. And then there's the voodoo that is still practiced in West Africa, that's from Benin and all of that kind of stuff. So I am more in the Louisiana Creole tradition of voodoo. So it kind of spontaneously happened. Yeah. Again, I was one of those things where I went looking for it.
I first of all, thank you for sharing that, and I had goosebumps because it's because there's so many questions that come up. I'm just going to say them, and then you can kind of like choose where you want to go. So the first question that came up, because I know that Christianity over the past 2,000 years, I know that there's this part of Christianity that has to go into it's like the white savior, like we are coming to save you and now you have to convert, and I would assume that a lot of which is why I'm so thrilled and so happy to hear that there is a thriving, or that it's expanding, because it's really about coming back to the roots. So there's that talk about that, quote unquote white savior, and how that has actually not only in, with the slavery and the slaves brought into the US, but basically all over the world, there's this like, we're right, you're wrong, and come to Jesus. Like, I can't stand it. So that's one. What was the other ones? No, now the other one. Oh yeah. And the other one is like, the how do you see the divine feminine? And I think we should preface this, and we talked about this before going on. So when we say divine feminine, we're not talking about like a wishy-washy, flowy, airy-fairy kind of divine feminine. I'm talking about what I would call the true divine feminine, which is the full embodiment of dark and light, and as well as the divine feminine or divine masculine, which is the same. So the question is, how do you see those essences, or in those faiths, religions, if at all? So it's either, do we go the white savior route, or do we go?
I mean, we can sort of navigate our way from one to the other.
Okay.
So it's interesting because when part of my part of my sort of personal amusement of being a Black woman who's practicing the Northern Folkways is that in many ways I'm kind of thumbing my nose at like all of the white supremacists who are trying to use pre-Christian Pan-Germanic and kind of Norse beliefs as like some type of weird propaganda template for the bullshit. Because the truth of the matter is that first of all, the people that we sort of shorthandedly call the Vikings were incredibly diverse, and they were spread out over quite a lot of area. There was no real sort of uniformity to the politics or to the religious beliefs of those people. And the closest that we have, and because we don't actually have a lot in terms of like ethnographic or like anthropological kind of information about their beliefs, is the sagas. And those were like the Icelandic sagas are very different from the Danish and the Norwegian sagas. And then even like the sort of oral mythology and kind of like the traditions of certain Germanic tribes, like varied from region to region, from family to family, from clan to clan. Yeah. So there's no real sort of uniformity in terms of beliefs. They also didn't have any sort of concept of race. And actually, recent archaeological finds seem to suggest that the Vikings actually heavily intermingled with traders from the Middle East, yes, and from Africa, in that there is possibly some of the same sort of cultural mixing that was experienced in Rome and also in Greece, which, you know, the white supremacists try to latch on to Rome and Greece too and go, "Here are white civilizations, yay!" Which is poppycock. And so there's part of that that's really fascinating to me. And also in terms of sort of like, again, pre-Christian, you know, European traditions, I wish more white people would take time to study those pre-Christian traditions, because I feel like sort of Europeanized, sort of politicized Christianity is part of whiteness's problem. Yeah. It's sort of latched on to Christianity as a sort of vehicle for disseminating political power and
supremacy, basically. I mean,
and for justifying colonialism under the banner of we have to go save all these savage souls, which no, thank you. So that's kind of interesting for me. And then in terms of voodoo, and in terms of just like the African traditional religions in general, of all of the pagan beliefs, or at least all of the polytheist beliefs rather, the African traditions have largely escaped sort of this synthesis into like New Age, neo-pagan kind of beliefs, largely because they're very culturally insular, and also because of anti-Blackness, quite frankly, because people hear voodoo and their brain goes all sorts of.
That was the third question. That was kind of the demonization, because the only way that we hear about voodoo is it's on quote unquote TV, and it always looks like, you know, you're someone killing a chicken, and it's always about violence and dolls and and I have an
and it's funny because all of those practices are actually things that exist in voodoo. And one of the things that I've been meaning to write about actually is a blog post about how practicing now two-faith casts that are theoretically accepting of animal sacrifice as a religious act has actually made me more vegan and more conscious in terms of how I relate to animal products, and also just to agriculture and just the planet in general.
I want to say that, because you mentioned blog, and I just want to say that in the blog post, or like underneath this video or somewhere else, I'll be linking to your Patreon page where people can come become supporters of you and your work and support you in your writing and so forth. I'm going to include all of it. I just wanted to put that in there, and then sorry for cutting you off.
Oh, awesome. No, it's cool. So I've been actually meaning to write that post on Patreon. But it's interesting because a lot of the practices that sort of like get thrown up as like there's like ooky spooky stuff do exist in voodoo. So like, for example, voodoo dolls or puppet dolls are voodoo. Well, I should backtrack. Voodoo fundamentally is a religion that centers around healing and sort of practical like human needs. The relationship between the Loa and in humanity is very much reciprocal. The community services the Loa then in turn sort of help nature kind of cooperate or like work in tandem with humanity.
Yeah.
In addition to that, voodoo itself, at least in the, I hate the term New World, but we're going to go with it. The sort of New World context is also monotheist. They believe in an ultimate kind of like creator spirit called Bondaye, which comes from the French, which means good God. But Bondaye is genderless. Bondaye does not interfere with day-to-day life. And the Loa are not gods. They're simply emanations of this kind of like divine, like supreme creator being. They're kind of, for lack of a better word to describe them, demigods. And so it's quite unusual. The cosmology is quite hierarchical and interesting. My point, I had a point about this, I lost track. Yeah, like there's a lot there. Oh, now I remember. So like a lot of the practices like get sort of taken out of this context and sort of painted as being like evil or, you know, heathens or savage or whatever it is, in part because it assisted assimilation politically, and also because real talk, white people are afraid of Black people who have power. And the sort of practicing this syncretic faith of engaging with these spirits gave these communities a sense of identity and power after they were stripped of, you know, their genealogy and all of this other stuff. So it gave them a sense of identity and a greater purpose that would enable them to have this sort of strength to fight back. And to sort of release themselves from bondage. And ultimately, what ended up happening in Haiti, and how sort of Haiti became the first free Black nation in the world, and also the first free Black democracy, I think, in the New World, or the free democracy. I'm not sure. I have to go look that up historically. Regardless, they were the first free Black nation. Is in part because of the practice of Haitian voodoo and of servicing the Loa. There is a ceremony that was done called the Boaskeman, where they sacrificed the Black pig, and they basically said, fuck it, we're done. And the next day they burned the entire island to the ground and slaughtered every white person on the island. Yeah. And that's how they freed themselves. Yeah. So a lot of this kind of like treating of the African traditional religions, be it Santeria, Lukumi, Candomblé, Voodoo, 21 Nations, whatever it might be, is largely driven by this need to sort of deprive Black and Brown people of sort of like a native spiritual power, and to sort of invest them in the political kind of power structures that Christianity is far more lended to than perhaps these I can't think of the word, centrally organized sort of indigenous faith practices.
Yeah. Yeah, and for me, well, first of all, thank you for sharing that. It's actually a question. I love how Spirit is working, because I actually had posed the question of like, what were the faiths of those enslaved, or, you know, what made them endure, and what made them quote unquote rise, and because and you basically just answered that, and yeah, that's just, you know, very, very beautiful. And for me, I think one of the reasons why I started the Magdalene Voices, that was because I want to shine a light on that, but also shine a light on, because for me, I get where you're coming from with Christianity, because that's where I come from, and I don't see myself as a Christian, although I walk with, like, I'm very, or feel connected to Mary Magdalene and Yeshua, but I've never felt connected to the church or to religion. And I find that that's, again, because of, you know, institutionalized, organized white supremacy, whatever we want to call it. There's no room for me in that, is what I find. And so beautiful.
Yeah.
how how if at all, because I don't want to put words into your mouth, but do you see that, is there like, do you have the divine feminine and the divine masculine? Because kind of, and I also, I mean, before when you talked about the whole Norse thing, I was sitting here thinking, it's so beautiful that I'm like white and Danish and I have no clue, and you're just, I love that. I just can't say how much I love it. So, but do you, the divine feminine or the divine masculine, do you see that in those faiths, or?
Yes. So it's interesting because both voodoo specifically, I'm not speaking to any of the other African traditional religions, so I'm just going to set that out here in advance. And this is based on what I know of sort of Louisiana Creole tradition, yes, not of Orthodox Haitian voodoo. Oh. So let me be very clear about my level of expertise here. But there's actually, it's interesting because there's a certain element of sort of gender queerness to both faiths. Because women in Norse society did not possess what a lot of people, like, if you just threw out the word divine feminine, there are certain like conditioned sort of beliefs that come with that about what constitutes femininity. And while Norse society was very gender stratified in some ways, for example, men who practiced sees, which is a type of Norse magic, were considered ergi, which was unmanly. And, you know, when we talk about sort of like homosexuality, for example, like men who were the receiving partner were considered ergi or unmanly, which was considered an insult, which is, you know, like a whole thing. So getting into like gender constructs. So there was a certain degree of flexibility.
So you're saying it was okay to give, but not to receive?
Yes. Yes. I know. I know. Like both voodoo as well as sort of like the sort of like Pan-Germanic Norse cultures had very flexible kind of ideas of what constituted like being a woman or being a man. Even though it still retained some of like the through like rigidity of like masculinity in terms of, you know, not so great things. Or femininity as submissiveness or whatever it might be, to a certain degree. There's still a little bit more flexibility and sort of fluidity to both of those traditions than you necessarily would see in, say, Roman society or even Greek society, where gender roles were very rigid in terms of who was allowed to do what. And even in the context of, you know, Judaism and, you know, some of the, like the Middle Eastern kind of Fertile Crescent kind of area traditions and faiths and sort of structures. So it's interesting because there is that flexibility there, but yet you also have kind of I don't want to call them essentialists, but we'll go with that kind of constructs too. So like, for example, in voodoo, you have Iserly Frida, who is very sort of feminine, quote unquote feminine. She loves luxury. She's very dainty. She loves pink. She freaking loves rosé and prosecco. Like, can't get enough. Yeah. Like, she's very like dainty and, you know, very much hyper femme in terms of our constructs of feminine and masculine. Yeah. And then on the flip side of that, you would have like Shango, or, well, Shango's and Orisha, but that's a whole other thing. Or like various Loa that sort of like embody like these really like heavy, like essentialist kind of masculine archetypes. So I would say yes and no. Obviously, my understanding, looking back at these traditions, as somebody in modern times where we're sort of unraveling what gender means, you know, kind of takes those things in the context of when they first sort of emerged. Yeah. And part of my practice, I feel, is sort of, I don't want to say taking gender out of it, but sort of allowing gender to find new definitions. Yeah. I don't know, that's not my area of expertise by any stretch of the imagination. I'm still learning a lot about gender as a social construct, especially I'm so very grateful for the gender non-binary people in my life in particular who write about this, especially in the context of spirituality. But the long answer is yes and no. I don't really think about it that much.
But it's so interesting because for me, divine, the divine feminine and the divine masculine actually has nothing to do with gender. And it should, I am it's called a cis woman, right? I am, straight, I am white, I am, so I conform with the, noun her and she, and so I'm speaking from I'm getting curious because it would be interesting to see if what someone who has is not conforming to a specific gender would see it. But the way can I talk about this then? So I'm speaking from my point of view. I just want to make sure so that the listeners know that if they do not resonate with it, take what serves you and leave the rest. And that is that for me, the expressions divine feminine and divine masculine has nothing to do with gender. For me, it has. I believe that both men and women, and we basically everybody have those two essences within us, and it's how we accept or embrace or empower them or work with them that in our spirituality and in our expression of it that they then that may it then become some form of a gender. I'm completely rambling, but my point is that for me these are not this has nothing to do with gender, because it's been done like it's been hyper masculine or hyper feminine, and there's a certain outlook or like a certain image that they're portraying, and that's very feminine, but for me, it's got nothing to do with gender. I
think it's a case of, and you and I were discussing this before, like whenever I hear divine feminine or divine masculine, like those terms or like those structures, oftentimes what I think has happened is it's taken from, and this is true of a lot of kind of like spiritual but not religious, new agey kind of spirituality, is that it's taken from these non-European, non-white cultures basically, and sort of watered it down and like twisted it to like fit a certain narrative. And this whole like dichotomy of like yin and yang, for example, which is where we kind of see like this division of kind of essences, and this obviously like transcends to different types of indigenous cultures. It's speaking to a quality of an energy or a quality force in nature that's not meant to be a strict duality, but manifests as a duality. And then it gets like translated into like this masculine, feminine kind of weird, funky boxes. And then it gets imposed onto gender, and it does all sorts of like weird and uncomfortable things. And so like from that lens, I do definitely, I see sort of, I'm sort of trying to figure out whether or not I'm a non-dualist or dualist. I don't know, philosophically. I'm still working out my feelings on that matter. But I do kind of see like the non-dual perspective of creation and destruction being kind of like the same force, just different sides of the same coin. So in a sense, there's not really a duality. We just perceive it as a duality on the basis of kind of like subjective context. And one of the places where this come up for me a lot lately is the sort of like function of violence, because the idea of violence is something that's unique to human beings. Like we don't really, when we look at aggression between animals or in nature, we don't necessarily term that violence. It's just aggression. It like we don't even necessarily have like a specific word for what those types of interactions are, even when like we get into kind of like our cousins with chimps. Like chimps will like go to war with one another. Like bands of chimps have been seen in nature literally picking up tools and beating the crap out of one another. But we wouldn't necessarily call that violence per se. It's just kind of like, yeah, like it's just aggression, and it's aggression, destruction, something. And
it's like, it's natural.
Yeah, it's natural. Yeah, we sort of perceive it as being sort of like part of the circle of life. And every time I say that, I feel like busting into song from The Lion King. But it's very much true. We sort of perceive it as kind of like this natural sort of, space in nature. But the thing about humans is that we've developed sort of like this self-aware kind of consciousness, like this complex consciousness, to where when we experience violence between humans, we call it violence because it feels like it's not natural, and we don't really, we haven't really, at least in Western, quote unquote, Western societies, we haven't assigned a healthy place to violence. We sort of treat violence as like a complete malfunction, rather than something that we need to find healthy boxes for. And sort of where I've seen this come up specifically recently is in the context of talking about the morals of punching Nazis, right? Where you have some people who are just like, it's never okay to punch a Nazi. And everybody over here who could die if the Nazis, get control, going, it's perfectly okay to punch a Nazi. And honestly, like, I'm in camp number 2. Like, I don't think the use of violence in that case is an aberration or a moral failing. I think it's a moral imperative, because it's not violence for the sake of violence. It's violence for the sake of protecting the community.
Yes.
And I think part of where we're sort of struggling spiritually, and where like a lot of this divine feminine talk can get a little reactionary, is that it's because they don't have a good place for sort of coming to a peace with the fact that if humans exist, some type of inter-human violence is going to pop off, like at some point. Like it just is part of the natural cycle of things. It's how we do it in the context of it, and how we relate to it, and how we think about it that changes things. I don't know if it makes any sense.
No, it totally makes sense. And what's so interesting about it is, like you mentioned before about, being vegan. I'm like 90% vegan, I would say. I'm not full on yet, but I'm working my way there. And my purpose has always been to do it in love. And it's been, the more I've learned about the industry, and the more, because when I say 90%, it's because, based in what I see in, like, if someone raises a pig and, feeds in it, and then slaughters it, I'm not sure that I'm not okay with it. I think I would be kind of okay with that, but it's the industry that we have throughout, where there has been there's no sense that we are connected. There's no sense of the cruelty and the violence that we are adding to animals. And it makes total sense. And what I find is interesting in what you're saying is that, with the aggression and the violence thing, is that we human beings consider ourselves to be like the smartest thing on earth. And it's like, hello, if we're the smartest thing on earth, why are people starving? Why do we have, slavery, in factories and in prisons and in, all over the world? Why do we have that if we're so freaking smart? Why? And sorry, go ahead if I
was about to say, no, like that's a great point. And I laugh because I was giggling, because it's true. Like, there's this sort of like human hubris about like our intelligence. And when you look at the human ecosystem, like the ecosystem that we humans inhabit, it is out of whack. It is completely out of whack. Yes. And nature is doing everything in its power to try and put it back into balance. And humans are just going, nah, I think I'm going to do X, Y, Z thing. And it's creating more destruction. And, it's throwing things further and further out of balance.
And nature will survive. Like humans think that, we're quote unquote doomed. Earth not.
Yeah.
I'll survive. They don't care about us. Like the earth, like nature will take its course. Like it'll course correct. Like so maybe humans won't be here for about, for 2 million years or whatever it takes to regenerate whatever. Sorry, I cut you off. It's just like
no. Well, and it's interesting because so part of my background too is that I am a practitioner of magic, and sort of I use magic as a tool in my life. And one of my teachers, Josephine McCarthy, who's a really brilliant woman, and we don't always agree on everything, but this is one of the reasons why I sort of gravitated towards the work that she does in the world. Is that she talks about magic as being in service of balance, and that the magician's job in all reality is not to sort of service themselves exclusively, but to service balance. And one of the things that she often says is like, nature's gonna be fine. Like humans are gonna like destroy themselves, and Mother Nature's gonna shrug it off like it was a bad case of crabs and be like, yeah, well, like, well, they were here. Now the fish is gone, and I'm gonna just go about my business.
Exactly.
And human beings haven't really, and this is reflected in capitalism, but also in terms of how we relate to resources, don't really process the long-term game that we are infinitely precious and fragile, but we're also not like nature doesn't care. Like the universe isn't gonna care if we stick around. Like maybe if the aliens come one day, if there are aliens, which is like a big question too. If the aliens do come, they're gonna be like, yeah, these puppets. Like I didn't mean to
here before, and then they saw what happened, and like, see ya, we're out of here. We're not like you can
yeah
on your own.
Yeah, like I'm pretty sure that if there's an advanced alien species in the universe that has the ability to channel intergalactically, they've already flung by this party, and we're just like, no. These folks
will come back.
Yeah, we'll come back in a couple thousand years and see where you're
at. So the thing, because we've gone way over time, but I have one question. I want to see if you want to, because this leads me into, because you were talking about, the whole faith thing and the violence, because as I see it, like, first of all, and I could be wrong, but the way I see it, it's like a pressure cooker. Like it's like violence normally in those situations occur when the pressure simply gets too high. We've had enough. Those people have have enough. That's the one thing, and that leads me into the quote unquote angry Black woman. That because you spoke about how, or did you speak? Was this me? I don't know. But it's like whenever. It seems as though whenever a white woman is mentioning her outrage or her blah, 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 whatever, she's revered and she's like put on a pedestal and is like, oh, you're speaking out. But it seems to me like very often when Black women or women of color do it, then they're called you're sure angry and you're like, so, and for me, the reason why I insist on calling it divine feminine is also because I want to add the divine is because where I'm from, divine is like people are shocked by the divine, like God. And, if you talk about God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit, like, oh, MJ, then people run, you must be a freak or whatever. So I try to use it as much as I can, both for myself to be able to voice it. And then also, because I really would just want to get rid of the whole stigma or the boxes or the organized religion kind of thing. That's my thing. But and I see. So for me, what I see when I see POCs or people of color or women of color speaking out, I see people who are like have had enough. It's like the pressure, like it have, and I can understand. I haven't walked their shoes, so I don't know if I want to presume that I can understand. What was I trying? So for me, the divine feminine is very present in, women of color or like those people speaking out, because that is the Kali or the one, like those are the cleansing ones that stand for truth and for justice, and for, those are not the wishy-washy, like there's quote unquote violence. If you look at someone like from the Hindu, like the Kali, that's the fire, like that's destruction, but it's destruction for rebuilding, for rebirth, for,
yeah.
Am I rambling? Am I making sense? Do you have
No,
time
you're making
to answer
sense.
this? Because I kind of
Yeah, no, you're making sense. And that's the thing, is that I feel like, in terms of, first of all, I feel like there needs to be sort of like a political and like social revolution around what constitutes the spiritual, and sort of an expansion and sort of a re-examination of what we term spiritual and how we relate to that sort of construct.
Okay.
And a lot of that for me has also come up through the work of Octavia Butler, who is a Black woman and a science fiction writer, and she wrote several books, but the ones that I've been sort of chewing on lately, again, are the Earthseed series, because the Earthseed verses, basically the protagonist of the story channeled this whole new religion. She was this Black girl in this post-apocalyptic kind of setting. And she channeled this whole new faith system, and it's basically religious naturalism. Anyway, setting that aside, I do feel like oftentimes what we see, like when people who are oppressed resort to, or antagonized by sort of like these power structures, resort to physical violence as a means of resistance. I think part of the reason why we sort of villainize the role of violence or aggression and sort of blanketly paint it as bad, is in part to that nobody actually resists these power structures that are oppressing them. So that anytime somebody asserts themselves and says, this shit over here, I don't mean to swear, but this garbage right here is oppressive, and we've had enough, and we are going to use whatever means necessary to resist this and to protect our children, automatically get painted as the villains, and are automatically kind of characterized as the people who are intentionally disrupting society, who are putting you out, who are antagonizing you, rather than seeing the truth for what it is, which is that these big structures, these social systems that we've all consented to in various ways, are harming them, or harming their children, or are robbing them of their ability to have space and to take up space. Yes. And a lot of times, and I think this is, obviously I'm not Hindu, and I need to sort of learn more about Hinduism, so I don't speak with any sort of great deal of authority here, but whenever I think of like Kali or any sort of like divine sort of like contemplation of destruction, oftentimes it's to make space. All of this is about making space and creating space for one another, for the process of life, for new life. When somebody dies, there's space for new life to be born. When somebody is born, space is created for that person to sort of step into the community. If we think about it in terms of what makes space, but not in like this like gross economics kind of mindset where it's just cannibalism and when we think about like how we're sort of making space and how things are flowing together, that's sacred, that's holy, that's divine, and that's part of what sacred activism and justice is for me. Like when I'm giving voice to my anger, I'm creating space for myself to be free. I'm creating space for my children to be free. I'm creating space for Black children to be children. Today is actually the anniversary of Tamir Rice, who was shot and killed 3 years ago, and he was just a little boy playing, and he was shot by police because he had a toy gun, and they shot first and didn't ask questions later. So whenever I express anger, or when women of color express anger, it's about creating space. And the thing about capitalism and about curiosity and ableism and sexism is it's about taking away space and constricting space and making things smaller and making things more compact and like smushing people, smushing things, so that only a select few can have space. And even those people really don't have space. It's all very fear driven. It's 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 resisting this temptation to sort of expand through lived experience, because it's very scary to change
Yes.
and to deal with change.
Yes.
And if we sort of deconstruct everything, I sort of think at the kernel of all of this is humanity is terrified of change. Humans are terrified of change. And I think that's part of the reason why Buddhism sort of emphasizes impermanence. Yeah. The only thing that, is certain is uncertainty, is impermanence. And that's kind of where, all of this kind of collides, is that the only thing that's consistent is that space is being made, change is always going. And we don't have a society right now that gives us or has values or structures that makes that okay. And I think that's where we're working towards, and why we're seeing some of these shifts away from kind of like these like really like titanic institutions, and towards flowing with Mother Earth and sort of the flow of the universe, and sort of accepting our impermanence here and our consistent change, rather than trying to fight it and sort of immortalize ourselves through things that are ultimately very fragile and will ultimately decay and fall apart. Yeah.
We're making space.
Yeah.
Like, seriously, I have 10 more questions, but this is going to be like, so I'm gonna, because I think this will be the longest episode ever, and I'm loving it. But
I'm sorry.
No, are you kidding me? Don't be sorry. I'm like, whoop, whoop. Don't be sorry at all. I just have to curb my. It's me. Like, I'm the one supposed to be in charge here, and it's gone. I've reset my alarm. I told you before we went on that I have a timer that I'm stopping, and I think I've turned it on or stopped it 3 times. So I'm gonna close it. Although I have many questions. Maybe you can come back at a later date.
Yeah, I'd totally be open to that.
That calls you. Alexis, I want to say truly a big thank you for all of the knowledge and the wisdom that you have brought to this episode. I invite, as always, everyone to take what serves them and leave the rest, but I also would encourage those who are listening to really have an open mind and an open heart, and hear the truth that is permeating your words. Just thank you for being here. Is there anything that you would like to, before we go? Is there anything that you would like to end off on?
Well, thank you for having me. I always love, as I said, I always love to have conversations with people about the infinite span of the universe. And yeah, basically, if this resonated with you, if you want to learn more about my sort of take on the universe, obviously my Patreon link will be below. I have a Patreon. $1 a month always goes a really long way around here. And you can find me on social media, Alexis P. Morgan. You can follow me on Facebook, and follow the Church of St. Felicia on its business page. And yeah, that's really it.
And I'll be sure to link to all of those so people can easily find it. And I encourage people to do so.
Yeah.
Thank
you.
That is what we have for you in today's episode of the Magdalene Voices. I hope it served you well. If you are listening to this via podcast, know that you can go to my website, mariaestela.com. That's MariaEstela.com for all of the deeds and the details. Finally, I hope you will take a moment to either leave us a comment or review and share it with your friends on social media. God bless.